Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and this week we are going a little deeper into this idea of identity and taking pride in our true identity as sons and daughters of God. And we're going to get a little bit more granular this week, talking about who we are according to the, let's call them assessments of personality. These tests that we can take that give us a sense of who we are. And there's a lot of derivatives of these kinds of things. So we come up with all these different identities, and a big one that's making the rounds again that was popular back in the 70s, and then it was quiet for a while, and then it's picked back up again, is the Enneagram. So we'll talk about that for a few minutes and look at things like that. We're going to talk about the Myers-Briggs and Temperaments and all these different fun, exciting, interesting types of assessments. You know, what Disney character are you? You know, we won't look at that one, but that's another example. But what does this all have to do with who we are? What does this have to do with our identity? That's what we're going to look at. All right, so I'll cue the intro here, and then we'll jump right in. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast. All right, so who are we? That's the question. I mean, really, that's the sort of whole point of this podcast, being human. What does it mean to be human? Who did God create us to be? And we have a lot of desire to categorize ourselves and to understand ourselves. And this is really good. It's a really good part of who we are. St. Augustine prays it. I talk about this a lot. You know, who am I, O Lord, and who are you? Help me to desire nothing except for you. Who am I? Help me understand who I am. That's really so important. And we have this deep yearning, longing for making sense of ourselves. And if we go really deep on this, we can see this this desire for understanding of ourselves present at the very base level of our identity from childhood. You know, part of the sort of momentum of developmental growth is this sense of how do I be. You know, and especially this is gender-based, like little boy, how do I be a boy? What is it to be a boy? Or for a little girl, what is it to be a girl? And, you know, there's a fascination with mom. There's a fascination with dad at a different time. There's fascination with older siblings or peers or people that we see around us in the culture. And it's like, oh, is this what it is? You know, is this what it is to be a man? Should I do this? Or am I supposed to do this? Or, you know, one of the hardest realities that we face sometime around post-adolescence into early adulthood is like, actually, nobody really wrote the book. There really is no book for your particular life. There's a little bit of an untethering that happens, and we get unanchored. You know, it's like, wait a minute, we're not just supposed to follow the rules and follow the path that somebody else lays out in front of us. Of course, we're not talking about spiritually where God has a path for us. Just being human, we have a desire from childhood to know who we're supposed to be, how to be what we're supposed to be. So if you could see that there's this drive which is present in the deepest core of our awareness of self. And then there's this, as if from somewhere in the depths, deeper than anything that we actually can see or clearly hear, it's this urge, this urgency to know who we are and how to be, what we're supposed to be like. So when you're scrolling on Facebook or wherever, and then you see those old, you know, those quizzes, I haven't seen them in a while, but I think they're still out there. Take this quiz and find out what Disney character you are. Take this quiz and find out which Lord of the Rings character or whatever, Hobbit or Harry Potter character or whatever. Something sparks inside of us where it's like, oh yeah, which one would I be? Because we want to put ourselves into these categories. And there are really good assessments to understand different dimensions of ourselves. But I want to make a distinction here between certain ones that are really validated, certain ones that are helpful, and then the truth of our identity that we need to make sure is really reserved and protected from some of the misunderstandings from these other quote-unquote assessments of our identity. All right, so let me jump right into what I mean here. Basically, what I'm saying is that the atmosphere, the connotation of these assessments that we can take, and now I'm not talking about the Disney quiz, but the ones that people get in pop psychology, and that are thrown around a lot, of the Myers-Briggs, even the temperaments, even this understanding of having a personality based on temperament, or another personality profile, which is heavily studied. We have this idea of oceans, and that's where some of these other, that's connected to the Myers-Briggs and some of these other ways of thinking about, when we get the introverted, extroverted, if we're conscientious, if we're agreeable, if we're open-minded. There are certain qualifications that people are saying, this is how I score. And, people they get to be well-versed in some of these assessment ecosystems. And then you sort of start to develop all kinds of assumptions about a human person based on what your score is, what your number is, what your letters are. Are you an ENFP? Are you a this? Are you a that? And it's an I am a that is problematic. This is what I want to help to flesh out a little bit more. And in terms of these other tests, and in the Enneagram is another one that people are talking about a lot now, where you have these numbers and you're based on this sort of constellation of numbers, and then you have your primary number, and then it has the wing number, and there's a lot of really deep description. And the thing is that these can be really robust. They can be lined up really well with certain observations that we are making of our current manifestation of our experience as a human being. But what does that mean? In other words, these are personality assessments on a superficial level, because it's about what we're doing now, how we're acting now, and the way that we're answering these particular questions, or the way that we are manifesting certain kinds of behaviors. And at the root of a lot of these assessments, there can be this assumption made, which I would argue is a false assumption. It's an error in thought that something about this test is defining us. So if you're an introvert, you're introverted. That is who you are. You are an introvert. If you're a number 7 on the Enneagram, that's who you are. And actually, I've recently spoke to an expert in teaching the Enneagram, and she made this point that I've never really studied enough to know whether this would have been true or not. But she made the point that, once you know your number, you actually always are that number. The number doesn't change. It's locked in. It's cemented. So it's really interesting because it's really, by their own admission and how they teach that particular system, that is the way that they look at it, which would not really make sense according to our anthropology. First of all, our definition of who we are is based on two things. There are two principles of our identity. Number one, the most important principle, is that we are a creature. We are created. We are children. That's the deepest way of understanding that first principle. We are children of God. Most important defining characteristic of what it is to be human. And second, the second characteristic of our identity is that we are either a son, a male child, or a daughter, a female child of God. So it's first that we are children of God, and second that male and female, he created them. Those are the two defining characteristics of our personhood. Those are the things that are unchangeable. Those will always be true. As soon as you exist as a creature who is a child of God, who is either a male or a female, period. That's the only unchangeable reality. Then we have, the ways that we manifest ourselves in this world. Through our behaviors, through our desires, through our ways of thinking, through the particular kinds of struggles that we have. And we can certainly categorize these things. And we can certainly understand patterns, and we can understand commonalities, and we can group together different people who are acting in similar ways or contrasted from different people acting in different ways. And all of that is well and good and can be very helpful. So I am not at all in any way trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater here and say none of this stuff is helpful. I find the Myers-Briggs really interesting. I find the Enneagram really interesting. And I also find the Temperaments very interesting. And the Temperaments themselves have thousands of years of background of thought behind them. So obviously we're not going to throw away something that's thousands of years old in the making of observation of human behavior. But I do think it's incredibly important to maintain a distinction about who we really are at the root of our identity before venturing out into this other water of things that we can use to describe ourselves in this world, our behaviors, those kinds of things. Because as soon as we conflate a description of our behaviors with the truth of our identity, well, that starts to open the door to a lot of other confusion. You can start to see, well, wait a minute, if we don't actually know what defines us as human persons, then a lot more becomes up for grabs. And we start to really sort of think about things with a lot of relativistic thinking. Because we're talking about something that is relativistic in terms of our manifestation of our behavior, in terms of it being cemented and defined. So then the things that are cemented and defined, being a child of God or being a man or a woman, then becomes confusing as well. So let's keep the distinctions. And let's make sure we understand. It's wonderful. If we're in this system of description of behaviors, let's stay there. Let's talk about that. I would say that if the system proposes that these description of behaviors are unchangeable, I would have a problem with that. And I see this all the time. Even let's look at something really simple like being introverted or extroverted. I think if you look at the lives of the saints, I think if you look at the life of Jesus Christ, who is the model for all humanity, we find in Christ the desire to be with others, to be rejuvenated and to be energized by being with other people, to be filled up with other people, and a lot of those ways those are the typical ways we understand an extrovert. And at the same time, we also find him needing to get away by himself, to be filled up and rejuvenated by his time of solitude. But then let's go deeper. In his time of solitude, aka introversion, he's also in deep communion with the Father and the Holy Spirit in the community of the Trinity. Wait a minute, we're back out into extroverted. I mean, is that what we mean? Well, maybe not in the most direct terms, but we could look at it that way. So do we need to pin down and say, well, was Jesus primarily an introvert or primarily an extrovert? Well, I don't know that God creating the world out of the image of Christ necessarily sort of wrote that distinction into the blueprint. I don't think, we don't find that in the book of Genesis. We don't find that in the core foundation of Catholic anthropology. So is it helpful to understand, like maybe I'm in an introverted phase of my journey in my life. Maybe I'm finding more energy right now in the times that I take in solitude. Absolutely. And then maybe there's another time where you say, like, now I'm filled up. I'm just so filled with what God is connecting with me in my prayer life and my inner solitude. And now I just get so much out of sharing it with the world and being with people and seeing the beauty in people and receiving from other people and this communion that we're built for. I think the ideal of humanity is that we are built to be both introverted and extroverted. And I'm just using one example here. And then in all these other manifestations of personality, of these characteristics, we can find that there are positives and negatives of every kind of description. And we are made for the positives of every description. We are made to be healed of and redeemed from the negatives of every descriptor. And we are made for the positives and the best version of ourselves of the descriptors of all those systems. So I do want to say a couple words because people ask about the Enneagram a lot. I have to admit I'm not an expert at all by any means of the system of the Enneagram. My observation, and this is just totally personal, this is just totally me speaking right off the cuff here, and I would say that just because sometimes people have curiosity about this and they ask, I get this question a lot actually, because the Enneagram has a history of being sort of written against and sort of seen by the church as something antithetical to the faith. And I don't really know the history as well as I could, but I do know that there is an entire system around the Enneagram, and it goes into a lot of spirituality. So what I've read from the church speaking against the Enneagram is that because of the system of spirituality around the Enneagram, there can be some misleading trajectory within it. And like I said, even to the way that it's manifest today and learning that there's this sort of crystallized, concrete understanding of that trait of a person that never changes, I would say that in itself is misleading. As far as the spirituality that surrounds the Enneagram, I will say that in any of the conversations I've had with people in 2021 here in contemporary time, I don't know that most people who are using the Enneagram as a way of understanding behavior are familiar even with the spirituality around it. So I'm not trying to be naive. I'm just saying that it can be confusing because if you just look at the system itself, it might look just like a Myers-Briggs or a temperament test or some of these other tests that are out there. But I don't think that's where the difficulties are coming from, because in a lot of the same ways, then we would have the same difficulties with the Myers-Briggs. So that's one of those distinctions that I think can be helpful. So I'm not giving a definitive answer here at all. And if the church is written against it, then the church is written against it. But I would just say, explore a little deeper if you're asking that question with that kind of curiosity. Maybe look into the history of this sort of esoteric, sort of spiritual, spiritish kind of system that surrounds that understanding of the person, and then the journey the person is on to get to the center between the numbers and all this stuff. And it does get a little bit wonky when you look at where it came from. But I don't see that as much today in the people who are utilizing it now as this new system, which feeds a little bit of that desire to have categorization of ourselves. So I just put that out there. When you hear things, when you're seeing things out there, always take it with a grain of salt. It might not be, straight from the pits of hell, when it really is people seeking the same thing that we're all seeking, which is to understand ourselves. At the same time, we do want to do our research and understand ways that we might be in danger of certain kinds of negative influences. So keep your mind sharp and keep your will intact and your intentions pure. And then the last distinction I wanted to make here is how these things differ from assessments that are validated and utilized in our profession of clinical psychology, in law, in evaluations and assessments in the workplace. And there are actually legitimate ways of understanding assessment with a capital A. And the difference here is, in order to be licensed, first of all, in order to use these assessments, you have to be licensed. It's part of having a psychology license in most states that to give an actual official legitimate assessment requires having, in most states, a doctorate in psychology with 3,000 to 5,000 hours of supervision and many years of experience of using these kinds of assessment tests. And these kinds of assessment tests are then validated with hundreds of thousands of uses, and correlated through deep dive scientific empirical data and peer-reviewed research to come up with conclusions that are, again, through the scientific method, our best case scenario of a kind of correlation that can be made between answering certain questions on a test, lining up with certain actual dynamics of a particular personality. But here's a caveat. Here's something to make this really clear. Those tests, which, by the way, are accepted in a court of law, for instance, if there's a custody hearing, or if we're trying to figure out the level of mental health of somebody who's accused of a crime, those assessments, none of those assessments claim to make a statement about a person's identity. Let me say this again. The validated assessments that require licensure to use don't make statements about a person's identity. And in fact, the purpose in many cases of using the assessment is to see how much the person does change over a course of time. So in other words, we might do a pre and post assessment for somebody going through a course of therapy. You come into the office and day one, we give you the assessment, and we're saying, okay, based on this assessment, your depression levels are here, your anxiety is here, we're seeing these different personality dynamics coming out. We use these tests to put all that on paper, and then we go through 6 months of a process, and now we're going to retest to find out if any of those scores have changed. And obviously, if there's scores that show a difficult symptom, we want those things to change. So this is the opposite of what this kind of assessment that gives a sense of having a crystallized dimension of our identity are actually leading to. So let's keep that in mind. So there's certain tests out there. There's something called the MMPI, the MCMI, even the Rorschach, which you might have seen in, it's oftentimes popularized in movies and things like that. The ink blot test, where you're looking at the picture and tell me what you see. Those kinds of things are very legitimate and incredibly validated, but they don't make a statement about identity. They make a statement about current functioning. So that's where these tests can be the most useful. So if we want to understand identity, we need to go to deep anthropology, philosophy of the human person. Who am I? How can I know who I am? If I want to go to a validated way of understanding my current manifestation of myself in time and space, there are plenty of these validated measures. And if we want something that's a little bit loosey-goosey, but in between those two, it's not going to give us a definition of our identity, and it's not necessarily even validated, but it might be useful, it might be practical, it might be fun, then certainly these other tests are somewhere in the middle. But let's be careful to keep everything in their proper category, because that's how we're going to stay on the straight and narrow and clear about who we really are. All right. Thank you so much. I hope that this has blessed you. And as always, I look forward to hearing from you, and I'm praying for you. God bless. Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.